Broadcasting from the Unshackled studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by the Unshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the weekly edition of WilmsFront on this Thursday, the 29th of April, 2021. It is 8:30 p.m. here in Melbourne, Australia. We are live on the WilmsFront YouTube and DLive channels, as well as on the enhanced entropy software, where you can ask questions of myself, my guest tonight, and also send through super chats. In 2021, we still have Western governments subjecting their citizens to COVID restrictions. We have toxic identity politics tearing nations apart and allowing the West's enemies to capitalize on these growing divisions to expand their own geopolitical influence. This breaking of nations, as we have witnessed over the past decade, has been carried out by the nation's own citizens. A major contributor to rising national self-hatred in the West is media and entertainment propaganda paid for and sold to Western consumers by a number of prominent globalists who for years have operated in the shadows, exerting undue influence on governments. But in the past year especially, their sinister activities are now gaining more scrutiny. Their aim is to centralize economic, legal, and security powers into a number of global bodies. To do that, obviously, they need to dilute the sovereign strength and unity of nations. My guest tonight has been warning about the growing influence of globalists and globalism that are having over our governments and culture. Richard Poe is an expert on the globalists, their beginnings and their influence. He is a New York Times best-selling author with his most notable book titled The Shadow Party: How George Soros, Hillary Clinton, and the Sixties Radicals Seized Control of the Democratic Party. It was published way back in 2007 and co-authored with David Horowitz. Richard is also a documentary producer and also a lifelong kayaking enthusiast. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And I know it's very early in the US at the moment, so I appreciate you coming on at such an early hour to, come on at prime time here in Australia.
It's my pleasure. Early to bed, early to rise. I'm an early riser.
Well, it's the healthiest way to go, as they say. Now, you first came to prominence in the what do you call it talk show circuit with your book on George Soros. You appeared on the O'Reilly Factor and on Glenn Beck's programs, and I think Glenn Beck was one of the first ones to make George Soros and his activities well known to a wider audience of people. And he is obviously much more well known, and people are aware of his activities more now. But let's go back to the beginning of George Soros's life. How did his life start, and how did he make his money?
Well, George Soros was a young refugee from Hungary, and he came to he left his native Hungary during the early years of the communist regime there. He had already lived through the Nazi occupation. He and his family had gone into hiding as they were Jewish. Then when the communists came in, young George decided it was time to go. Interestingly, Mr. Soros states himself that he didn't so much flee from communism. Actually, he had to be talked out of going to Moscow. His first impulse as a young man, I think he was probably around 16 or 17 at the time, he discussed with his father where should he go. And his first impulse was to go to Moscow and basically to join the communists and the communist movement, because he said that's where the power is. It was his father who said, no, Don't go to Moscow, go to England. And the unspoken part of that story is, and I think Mr. Soros's father understood this better than young George did. I think what he was telling his son is, no, no, no. Even though, yes, you see this powerful Red Army occupying our country, don't be deceived. That is not where the real power is. It's not in Moscow. The real power in this world is in London. I believe this advice from his father was not only correct, but it steered the life of young George Soros for the rest of his life until this present day, because his father gave him good advice. The power was not in Moscow, the power was in London, and it wasn't in Washington either. It was specifically in London. And this is one of the messages that I try to bring people more than anything else these days, especially. I've known for 30 years about what I call the hidden influence of British power or the British Empire, if you'd want to call it that. They no longer call themselves that, but I think it's still appropriate. And George Soros is an integral part of that machine. He spent 10 years in England. He graduated from the London School of Economics. He based his entire foundation system on the principle of the open society, which he learned from his professor Karl Popper, the philosopher who was teaching at the London School of Economics. And what they teach at that school very specifically, that school was set up by the Fabian Socialist movement, which is sometimes known as the liberal imperialist movement. It might be better described as the socialist imperialist movement, since most people who took part in this thing called liberal imperialism were actually socialists. But Karl Popper, as a philosopher, now he was from Austria, he was a refugee like Soros, but he thoroughly imbibed the elixir of English economics in the form of what came to be called political economy. This is the subject they teach at the London School of Economics. What they do at that school is they train people to be servants of the empire, to be servants of the global world order, which was actually built by the British. And this, I think, is what people fail to understand because our memories are so short. The world we live in today is an English-speaking world. If you don't speak English as your native language, you have to learn it as your second language. This is a world that is dominated by English-speaking peoples. It's right there in front of our faces, and it's obvious. Now, the myth is that the reason everybody speaks English is because there's this American empire, so-called, this American colossus. But I would argue, and there are a few other researchers out there whom I could name, and perhaps will before this podcast is done, but there have been a number of researchers who've looked past the obvious in this post-war world since 1945, and who have come to realize that, the British are very good at understatement. They're very good at exercising power quietly and behind the scenes, and not making a display of their power. And I would contend, and some other researchers who studied this question would contend, that the United States is actually subservient to Britain, even to this day. That it's, this whole kind of media propaganda idea that the British are a lapdog or a poodle to the almighty American president. I think this is a propaganda narrative, which is just not true. And I think if you look at the history, you can see that it's not true. It's really quite clear. It's not complicated. In fact, I have an article that just went up today at LouRockwell.com. and it's called How the British Invented Globalism, which speaks to this very subject. And it just goes through on the most obvious level what happened, and the most by most obvious, we don't have to get into all the esoteric conspiratorial things here yet necessarily, but on the most obvious level of plain history, the British Empire was supreme at the end of the 19th century, at the turn of the century, and at that time, it was widely understood and widely assumed that their power would continue to increase and we would live in a world under British rule. Now, British elites, British decision makers had been aware of their rising power for some decades and had been making plans for a world under British dominion. And the crucial element of this plan was to reacquire the United States, to bring the United States back into the British system, and hopefully, they hoped, in at least a somewhat subservient role where they would be able to quietly influence what America did by exercising what we call soft power at the highest levels. And soft power is, well, it's real power, but it's power that doesn't, it's not the exercise of military might necessarily. It's the power of bribery, corruption, and appealing to people one-on-one through familial relationships, through personal relationships, and basically identifying, it's exactly the same technique that the British had always used, that they were experts at using in so many other countries throughout the world, which is to go into a colonial area and identify the elites, identify that small group of families, that small group of people who were corruptible and who were powerful, and to give them money, to give them praise, to give them attention, often intermarrying with them. That happened a lot with our American Anglophile elites. And through this means to create a culture, this inside the Beltway culture in Washington, D.C., which I will tell you, Tim, I don't know if you folks in Australia really understand this, but the elite Beltway Washington culture is Anglophilic to the core. They love Great Britain. There's nothing more important to them than to please the English. There is no diplomatic post that carries more prestige than to be the ambassador to the court of St. James. It seems strange to say this and for people to hear this, because this is not the propaganda narrative of the mass media. But this is the way it is. These people in Washington want nothing better than to please the British. In their minds, we are still subservient to them. And yes, we have so much more money and so much more weaponry and so forth. But I would ask you to consider, excuse me, this has always been the situation with the British. Excuse me. When I first began speaking to people about this subject many years ago, people who were new to it, they would say, well, England is just a small little island. How could they have this power? And I have to tell people, do you know that England is the same size now that it was in 1850? It hasn't changed its size by 1 square centimeter since the so-called peak of British power, which was supposedly more than 100 years ago. They've always been small. They've always been resource poor, and they've always had a shortage of manpower for doing things like massive military operations. And so the British became experts at manipulating other countries and other peoples to do what they want. And for example, the famous massacre at Amritsar in 1919 in India. Those were Indian troops. They were dressed in British uniforms. They were trained by the British. They were brainwashed to do as they were told. There was one British officer and hundreds of, I don't know how many hundreds of Indian soldiers who massacred their own people. This is the genius of the British Empire. This is the secret of their power. It's psychological. They are masters at mass psychology. They are masters at getting people who are more numerous and physically powerful than them to do what they say. And this is how they acquired control. I would call it control or something close to control of the United States. And it happened this way. Prior to World War I, the British were already making plans to make war against Germany. They knew there would be a contest. Germany was on the rise. Germany was becoming a great manufacturing power and competing with the British. And worst of all, Germany was building a great fleet which could compete with the British fleet on the high seas. So they launched an initiative called the Round Table, in which they sent operatives to all English-speaking countries, including Australia, including the United States, and semi-secretly, it was very hush-hush, this roundtable operation, just as I described, targeting people who were deemed to be up-and-coming elites, people who were opinion leaders, and so forth, and getting them to enlist in this idea of imperial federation. The initial idea was to get all English-speaking countries in the world to join an actual federation and to, in a sense, become the same country. Well, that didn't work. Nobody really wanted that. The Australians, the New Zealanders, the Canadians, everybody said, no, we want independence. And so instead, the Round Table offered something else, which was this dominion arrangement, where the English-speaking colonies would get self-rule. They would be self-governing internally, but their foreign policy would be overseen from London. And this was the deal of dominion, which basically all the English-speaking colonies accepted around the turn of the century, around, I guess, between 1909 and maybe 1914, around there. Now, in the U.S., it was a little more difficult because we had been formally independent since 1776, or if you like, since 1783. That's when England finally recognized her independence. And moreover, our relations with Britain had been quite stormy up to that point. People forget, aside from the obvious problems of the Revolution, the War of 1812, there were also border disputes with Canada. There was British meddling in our Civil War. There were a lot of problems. It was a very uneasy relationship. But the British, being the very deliberate people that they are, they confronted this situation and they rolled out this initiative called the Grand Rapprochement in the 1890s. It was a huge public relations campaign to try to convince the Americans, us, that it was time to mend bridges, mend fences, build bridges, and make friends again with our mother country. And it worked. And there were many so-called Americans who were going along with this to the point of being actual operatives of the British. One of them was Andrew Carnegie, the great steel magnate who basically built the American steel industry. Now, Carnegie was born in Scotland. He was really a Scot in his heart. He came to America. He made this fortune. But when the British launched this Grand Rapprochement, Carnegie got right up in front, and he published books. He gave huge amounts of money through his foundations, all toward the goal of actually reincorporating the United States into the British Empire. Now, what happened, as we all know, it didn't quite go as planned. World War I started, and at first, Americans wanted nothing to do with it. But Woodrow Wilson had British spies very close to him in the White House. And one of these spies was a guy named Colonel. He wasn't really a colonel, but he was called Colonel Edward House. He was a Texan. He had strong family ties to England. He and his brothers had attended boarding schools in England. His father was English born. During the Civil War, Edward House, that is his father, had run a blockade running operation basically for the British, bringing in arms to arm the Confederate rebels, and in exchange exporting cotton to the British for their textile industry. So this guy's father was basically a British agent, and so was his son, Colonel Edward House. He was very close to our president, Woodrow Wilson. Now, every school child learned in school, at least they used to. I don't know what they teach in school nowadays. When I was in school, everyone said, our president, Woodrow Wilson, was an idealist. He believed in world peace. He believed we should have a League of Nations. Exactly. But what people don't realize, and I cover this in my article, How the British Invented Globalism, which is on Lou Rockwell today. In fact, all of these so-called ideals had been spoon-fed to Woodrow Wilson by this cluster of British spies who were clustered around him. There was Colonel Edward House, who was in constant touch with the British government at the highest level, with the British Foreign Office, comparing notes, telling them how everything's going with President Wilson. And then there was a man named Sir William Weissman, who in fact was the U.S. station chief for the British Secret Intelligence Service for the United States. He was intimate friends with Colonel House. House introduced him to the president, and they all became friends together, even vacationing together. They became very intimate friends, and if you read certain histories of British intelligence, you'll see this man Weissman praised very highly as the greatest agent of influence who ever appeared in the history of British intelligence. And the reason he is praised so highly is because he was able to gain control of President Wilson with the help of Edward House, and basically to persuade him to enter the war a little bit later than the British had wanted, but to enter the war on the side of Britain. And we lost over 100,000 men in that war. And furthermore, to get behind this idea of global government. This was the beginning of globalism, the League of Nations. Now, who thought of this? Was it Wilson? No. In a letter of 1915, I think his name was Sir Edward Grey. He was the British Foreign Secretary. He sent a letter to Colonel House saying, well, look, we'd like to start this League of Nations, but we don't want to propose it ourselves. It would be much better to have a U.S. president propose it. Do you think you could get President Wilson to propose this idea as his own? And Colonel House said, of course, no problem. And they got him to do it. So Wilson then got up there and said, let's have a League of Nations. It was a completely British idea from the get-go. The British had been talking about this and planning this for decades. In fact, H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer, had written about it at length in a book called The War to End War, published in 1914. And H.G. Wells, in saying this, was not just giving his own ideas, because Wells himself was an operative of Britain's War Propaganda Bureau, known as Wellington House. And so he was simply doing his job as a propagandist and putting out this idea of a peace league, as he called it. And then, so he was selling it to the public, H.G. Wells, saying, let's have a peace league after this war. And he wrote this only days after the war was declared. And then quietly through diplomatic channels and through, as I said before, familial channels, such as this man, Edward House, whose father was born in Britain, etc. This is how soft power works. You see, we have had in our country since the very beginning, and I'm saying going back to the revolution, after the Battle of Yorktown, when we finally supposedly defeated the British Army, the Continental Congress began expelling all so-called loyalists. We called them Tories in those days. People who were still loyal to England. They were actually being expelled. Many of them went to Canada, some went to England, but we were trying to expel them all from the country. 2 years later, the peace treaty was signed in 1783, and one of the conditions of that peace treaty is stop expelling the loyalists. The British are very smart, as I said. They knew that if loyalist families, especially prominent ones, remained in the country, excuse me, I'm having a small technical problem.
Oh, we can still hear and see you clearly. It's just
Okay.
from time to time, it's just sort of frozen intermittently, but it always corrects itself.
I just had a big window open up, so I had to kill it. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but am I rambling on too long? Am I?
Oh, I'll bring it back to, because I started asking about George Soros's early life, and you've explained through a crash history lesson about how the United States was enticed into globalism, and that's fitting in why George Soros, after the war, believed that London was the source of global power. And given that the center of global power in London in particular has always wanted to bring the US back into the globalist tent, that's why George Soros and his political activities has been so focused on undermining the independence and the sovereignty of the United States. That's always been his focus.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. And this is, in a sense, the main message that I want to get out to people, because way back when I first started writing about George Soros, now actually, you correctly mentioned that I appeared on the O'Reilly Factor in 2004, and that was the first time I had ever spoken out against Soros. But I'll tell you, in all honesty, the first thing I wrote about Mr. Soros was actually quite positive. This was back in 1993. I wrote a book called How to Profit from the Coming Russian Boom. It sounds a little ludicrous to some people now, but in those days, in 1993, everyone thought Russia was going to have a huge economic boom now that communism was dead, and it was going to be like China is today. And so I wrote a very optimistic book, and I wrote about Mr. Soros. I actually called him, his office, trying to get an interview, and he couldn't do that. But he allowed me to interview some of his functionaries in Russia. And so it was all very nice. And at that time, I have to explain. Now, I was strictly a business writer at that point. I wrote about business and finance, and I was writing a book about the wondrous changes happening in Russia and how we're going to have free enterprise, and Russia was going to rejoin the Western world, and it's all going to be so wonderful. And George Soros is helping to make this happen. A lot of people don't know this about me. You know, they think I'm just some guy who hates George Soros, and I quite the contrary. I admired him back then. I knew he was into some sketchy things, but who isn't? Anyway, I certainly supported and admired what he was doing in Russia to the extent I understood it. I wrote very
In a
positively about him.
financial sense.
Yes, and bring in the sense of specifically helping to bring capitalism, quote unquote. This is how a lot of well-meaning people like me, like us, get roped into the globalist agenda by thinking somehow capitalism and free trade and all of these buzzwords somehow equate with human freedom. Right. So I was very much into that mindset then. I'll admit it. And I will admit I was trying to please George Soros by writing about him, but it didn't work. He wasn't pleased. I think it was interesting. I had a conversation with a Greek businessman who apparently knew Soros right after that book came out, and he looked at me very strangely, and he said, you know, Soros is going to read your book. I said, no, he doesn't have time to read my stupid book. And he said, oh no, you named him. You wrote his name. He will definitely read your book. He's very interested in anything anybody writes about him. And I said, really? And I started feeling a little nervous. I was like, okay, well, I hope he'll approve. Well, I think he didn't approve. Because, see, what I had done in that book is I pointed to the privatization process that was occurring. At that time, the Russian government was privatizing massive amounts of state-owned properties, and it was supposed to go to the Russian people. They were supposed to issue what they called vouchers of worth 10,000 rubles a piece, and each Soviet citizen was supposed to get one of these vouchers, and they could do whatever they wanted with it, sell it, exchange it for more vouchers. Well, I was actually praised in the London Financial Times for being the first writer to really explain this process. And I thought, oh, great. The book was very well reviewed in all the right places, library, journal, etc. But I kept having this nagging thing in my mind that this Greek businessman had told me, saying, oh, Soros will read your book. And I kept thinking, will Mr. Soros like my book? Well, I think he didn't, because just a couple years later, another book came out, and it was called The Coming Russian Boom. Very similar title to my book. My book was How to Profit from the Coming Russian Boom. This book was called The Coming Russian Boom, and it had a similar cover design. And right on the back was a huge blurb by George Soros saying, this is the book to read. This is a real insider's look at Russia. And then a reviewer, who I later found out was a Soros operative, wrote a review saying, don't read Richard Poe's book. Read this new book, The Coming Russian Boom. So they had basically replaced my book within 2 years of publication. They replaced my book with another one, which was stamped with the Soros stamp of approval. I felt so betrayed. No, not really. I'm just exaggerating. But I did feel like, well, gee, come on, George, give me a break here. I tried to write nicely about your operations, but he didn't like it. I think what he didn't like, assuming he really was personally involved in this, which seems to be the case, I think what he didn't like was the focus that I put on the privatization process, as the Financial Times had noted, because Soros was then deeply involved in corrupting that process through closed auctions and through proxy relationships. Soros and other foreign businessmen bid for these 10,000 ruble vouchers, and they weren't supposed to by law. These were supposed to go to the Russian people, and they bought up all the vouchers. And then around the same time, Soros and Jeffrey Sachs and all these shock therapy economists tanked the Russian economy and triggered hyperinflation in Russia so that these vouchers would be worth nothing. So when Soros and all these other Western operatives, and it's important to understand, Soros is just one of many. This is the point that I would like to make. He's not the puppet master. He's not Dr. No. He's not what he's made out to be by the major media. He's really kind of a psyop. He's a face who's put in front of us to look at, and in a sense to mock us, to say, look, we can do whatever we want. Excuse me?
He's put his face up on the screen there. That's
right. Yes, and that's the interesting thing about him too. You know, when he famously broke the Bank of England, quote unquote, he immediately got up and started bragging about that, saying, I broke the Bank of England. Now, people in that business, that currency arbitrage business, who go around speculating in sovereign currencies and doing terrible damage to countries, people in that business are extremely secretive. Let me tell you, the one thing they don't do is go on TV bragging about what they did, because that's a really good way to get investigated and arrested. But that's what Soros did. He bragged about it. And the fact is, his brag wasn't even true, because there were many, many other individuals and institutions who did it with him, who all wisely and typically kept their mouths shut and stayed out of the limelight. Soros deliberately came out into the limelight, and he's been known ever since as the man who broke the Bank of England. And he's not the man who broke the Bank of England. He was just part of a team. But he was the one who stepped forward as the front and took credit for it, a very unusual thing to do. And he's done that many, many times throughout the world in many countries. He has deliberately presented himself as the culprit, so everyone can hate him and blame him, when in fact he's only one of many culprits. In some senses, he's there to distract attention from others, for others more powerful, others who are more deeply involved in these things than he actually is. So
in a way, when Soros is described as, what is it, the boogeyman that the right wing use to talk about the advancement of progressive causes and politics, that's somewhat true, because obviously his Open Society Foundation funnels money to various causes, but there's other Soros type people in the background doing exactly the same thing as he is quietly. Is that what you're alluding to?
Yes. Let me be clear. Everything that's been said about Soros, about all of his wicked schemes throughout the world to undermine sovereignty, to change our culture, to break economies, and to force globalism on people who don't want it, all of that is totally true. George Soros is everything he's been accused of being. I'm not trying to get him off the hook, but I am saying that Mr. Soros, he's not the puppet master, as Glenn Beck famously called him. He's more of a middle manager. He is part of this globalist apparatus. He's a very important part, but the part that he plays, as far as I can tell, is not so much an operative role as it is a media role. His job almost is to present a certain face to the media, and this is why he has such a strange dual nature. On the one hand, he's a currency speculator of all things. On the other hand, he's a human rights activist. How do you put those two things together? Well, they go together.
have democratic politicians over in the West.
Correct. Now, the thing is, putting crass self-interest in the form of things like currency speculation and regime change, and coupling that with a pretense of being interested in human rights. This is the essence of British imperial policy. George Soros did not invent this. The British Empire invented human rights. They invented the whole concept of human rights and of using human rights as a tool of power in order to intimidate and manipulate other countries. This was a British invention long before Mr. Soros was born, but he learned it.
So-called human rights, because everyone has different views on what are human rights.
Correct. And the official human rights that are pushed by globalist organizations are, of course, very, very different from the human rights that you and I, that normal people would regard as
U.S. Bill of
humane.
Rights.
Yes. Now, to this end, I would give an example. There was, you may remember, I think it was last year, Alan Dershowitz came out and made a curious announcement. He said, I have evidence that President Obama conspired with George Soros to get the FBI to investigate someone, and that Obama did it. He said very provocatively. And he said, and this is all going to be litigated, he said, and very soon. Well, 8 months went by, nothing happened. So I wrote an article, or really a multi-part thread on Twitter, basically giving my view of my theory as to what Mr. Dershowitz was talking about. I believe the man he was referring to was an Israeli billionaire named Benny Steinmetz. Mr. Steinmetz is currently suing George Soros in federal court in New York, here in the US. He's suing him for $10 billion, and he's suing him for defamation, extortion, tortious interference with business, all these other things. And basically what happened, according to Mr. Steinmetz, if you read the court papers, it's still in court. I think it was filed in 2017, and the motions are flying back and forth. It's still in court. What Mr. Steinmetz alleges against Mr. Soros is that basically Soros came in with his whole human rights apparatus in cahoots with Tony Blair and a number of other British figures. Lord Malloch Brown was involved, and a few others, the usual crowd of people that Soros does his operations with. And they went into the African nation of Guinea, and they got close to the president, a guy named Alpha Condé, and basically convinced him to rescind some mineral rights agreements they had made with Benny Steinmetz. Now, you'll be interested to know, as an Australian, that the Anglo-Australian firm of Rio Tinto was working in cahoots with Mr. Soros on this operation. They had a big a so-called iron ore concession from the Guinean government, and they weren't doing anything with it, allegedly, for many years. So then Benny Steinmetz came in and said, give it to me, I'll invest all this money, I'll build a railroad, I'll develop it. So Mr. Steinmetz made a deal with the Guinean government. Rio Tinto went crazy. They said, that's our concession, you stole it, you must have bribed somebody, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, George Soros appears with his whole human rights parade, saying Benny Steinmetz is a corrupt a Western mineral extractor who's unfairly treating the native people of Africa. And along with Mr. Soros, were the usual crowd of human rights NGOs, one Global Witness prominent among them, accusing him of all kinds of corruption, bribery, what have you, and basically succeeded in getting him arrested and investigated in half a dozen different countries, including the US, Switzerland, his native Israel, France, I think. All over the world, he was under criminal investigation. And what was interesting about this is that Rio Tinto later admitted that they had been involved in bribery in connection with these matters, but somehow that was okay. So Steinmetz was specifically targeted by George Soros, and there is an allegation in the complaint, in Mr. Steinmetz's complaint, that in 2011, George Soros met with President Obama and arranged for all these investigations to happen. This is an allegation. I don't know what proof he has, but I wrote an article on Twitter basically saying, I think this is what Dershowitz is talking about, because when Dershowitz said, somebody met with Obama, or Soros met with Obama and got him an FBI investigation against someone, that's what I thought. I thought that sounds like Benny Steinmetz. So I put it out there. Attracted no attention, totally ignored. So who knows? It's we'll see what happens in court. But this is the kind of thing that this is the way that human rights campaigns can work with corrupt imperial campaigns,
using the power and influence of these NGOs. And we haven't even got onto the media influence as well. If you get the NGOs to say that this they can do Mr. Soros's dirty work for him, and so can the media. So they demonize the businessman that you just described, and then they can get the deal. Then there's no more scrutiny.
Exactly. And so what happens is that the human rights angle just becomes another weapon of empire. And this goes way back, all the way to the beginning. You may recall from history that part of the pretext for the Zulu War was accusing the Zulu king of human rights violations. So this is nothing new. This has been going on, and it's an integral strategy of British imperial policy, which the British basically invented and perfected, and of which they are the masters. Now, I would mention another thing about Mr. Soros. I do have the dubious distinction of having been one of the first, maybe the first, American journalists to start making an issue out of Soros's involvement in what are called color revolutions. There were a lot of people who didn't like Soros. They saw he was giving money to all kinds of bad causes, and people were beginning to write about this, let's say around 2004. But there was one subject no one would talk about, and that was Soros's regime change operations. His involvement in what we now call color revolutions, which is organizing basically fake elections, where overturning an election through orchestrated crowd actions, bringing in international vote counting authorities, NGOs.
Around about that time, 2004, Ukraine comes to mind. Is that what you're going to be talking about?
Yes, the Ukrainian Orange Revolution is one of the most notorious examples, and it's certainly known that Soros was involved. But there were many, many others. The overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic in 2000, many, many of these operations. And this topic, although it was widely written about in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states, which is how I knew about it, if you read Russian publications and such, this was a very well-known fact that Soros was involved in these operations. Soros himself bragged about them, actually. It shouldn't have been a secret issue or a secretive issue because he wrote in his books, he wrote in his articles, he bragged about them. But for a journalist, and especially a journalist who was deemed to be in opposition to the State Department, Council on Foreign Relations establishment, to speak of this and to speak of it negatively instead of praising Mr. Soros for doing this, criticizing him for it. This was strictly forbidden. It was such a third rail. If you spoke of these things, you would be called a conspiracy theorist, a nutcase, an anti-Semite, everything. They would just. It was the third rail. As a journalist, as a working journalist, full time, which I was at that time, this was simply not permitted. And so I wrote about it for Newsmax magazine in the May 2004 issue of Newsmax. And what happened is I was actually one of the original columnists at Newsmax, so I knew Chris Ruddy pretty well. Chris Ruddy, the founder and editor of Newsmax.
Was also, well, I should explain, he came to prominence by questioning the suicide of the Clintons' former counsel. His name escapes me now.
Vincent Foster.
Yes. And he was hatcheted on 60 Minutes US about it.
Correct. Yes. I have tremendous admiration for Chris and everything that he's done. As he became more of a mainstream media person, Newsmax got bigger, investors started coming in. He moved away from the Vincent Foster type of stuff, tried to become more mainstream, and that's fine. I mean, you got to make a living. I get it.
Oh, Newsmax it's evolved into a website and now TV channel.
Correct.
You would still say that it's very bold in its reporting and editorial stance, much more than Fox News.
Absolutely. I love Newsmax. I think it's a very important voice in the media. But what happens is, and it's happened to me as well, I like to say we're all controlled opposition to some extent. We all, as you get higher up the food chain, you start getting on national TV shows, whatever, you have to become more careful. And what happened, I guess I was a little less careful than others, because I felt I was onto a very big story with this Soros thing. And so I ended up pursuing it for a number of years, and maybe a little bit longer than I should have. But now what happened in 2004, so Chris called me up. He said, let's do a cover story, an expose of George Soros. I said, okay, fine. At that point, I'd never written a single negative word about the man. As I described, the only thing I'd ever written about him almost 10 years earlier was positive things in my book about Russia. But I certainly knew he was doing bad things. And I'm getting a little hoarse, so I just took a cough drop.
No worries.
Sorry?
I knew it was some sort of, I thought it was a mint, basically, but whatever helps you keep talking.
I'm getting hoarse for some reason. I don't know why. Anyway. So I get a call from Chris, and basically he gave me this golden opportunity. He says, we'll put it on the cover. You can just say whatever you like, expose George Soros. And I discovered that there was a guy named Nick Simonek. He was a British guy, very upper crusty, British sort of gentleman, who was working with Chris on this. And he's dead now. He died a few years ago. But I got the impression this Nick Simonek, I don't even know if he disagreed politically with Soros, but he just didn't like him. I think he was his neighbor in the Hamptons, and he said, he's an ill-mannered man. He has no class, this and that. He seemed to dislike him personally, but whether he disliked him politically, I don't know. So anyway, it was Chris and this guy, Nick, sort of egging me on let's get Soros. And to make a long story short, we published the story. It was a big hit. I was on the O'Reilly Factor. The very next day after the O'Reilly Factor, an outfit called Media Matters for America just did a full court press against me. They just said, Richard Poe, how could Fox News, how could a respectable news organization have a guy like Richard Poe talking about George Soros and saying, what's that guy's name who runs Media Matters? David Brock.
David Brock.
Right. Yep. David Brock had an open letter to O'Reilly saying, I demand equal time to go on your show and defend George Soros. And it was CC to Roger Ailes. And then they just kept going and going and going, really hammering. First, they did all this stuff saying that I was a liar. I got all my facts wrong, that I'm a right-wing extremist or whatever. And then they started hitting on O'Reilly, really hitting on him. How could you? How could you do this? What kind of journalist are you? What don't you think about your reputation? So this was kind of the beginning of these fact-checking disinfo police type of operations. Media Matters for America was the first
early form of cancel culture, you could say.
Exactly. So I was stunned. I'd never experienced anything like that before, ever. And at that time, I was quite a prominent author. I'd been a full-time author for 10 years. Very few people have done that. Usually people who write books have a day job. All I did was write books. And so I was used to being on TV. I was used to being a public figure to some extent, but I'd never been slammed like that. It was quite shocking. And I have to say, I didn't like it. It made me a little uncomfortable, but I thought, okay, well, I'm writing about politics now. And so I have to toughen up, and step up to the plate and all that. So, but what happened was, I wanted to keep writing about Soros. I had a regular column at Newsmax. And what happened is they didn't let me. And I don't blame Chris for this. I don't blame Nick Simonek, the late Nick Simonek. What happened is the chairman of Newsmax Media at that point was a guy named Lord William Rees-Mogg. And that name may or may not be familiar with you.
Yes, it is familiar.
There's, Jacob Rees-Mogg is his son. So Lord William Rees-Mogg, who died in 2012, he was actually the chairman of Newsmax, and he stepped in. And I was there when it happened. We had a meeting over lunch. All the top Newsmax executives were there. We were all there, and Chris and Nick were on either side of Rees-Mogg and basically trying to make him understand, Soros is a bad guy. We've got to go after him. And Rees-Mogg, he didn't go for it. And Rees-Mogg was calling the shots. And that's one of these examples that I can give you from my personal experience of how British influence is there. Although, how many people even knew that Rees-Mogg was chairman of Newsmax during that time? They have a positive genius. The British, have a positive genius for exercising soft power in countries where they want to kind of steer and guide things. So anyway, Chris was very nice about it. He was very honest and very nice. And he said, well, Rees-Mogg's not going to let us go after Soros anymore. And I said, fine. And I could have kept writing for Newsmax, just avoiding the subject, but what can I say? I was young, I was full of fight, and I felt I was onto a big story, and I just wanted to keep going. And so I went back to the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I had previously worked there. I had been the editor of his website, Front Page, earlier, and I went back. David hired me back, and he was launching a new website called Discover the Networks, which was aiming to make a kind of comprehensive database of all the left-wing people. Of course, the Horowitzian view is that it's all the left, this entity called the left. And it is to some extent, but I don't think the left would exist without a lot of state-level support from governments. So to call it the left it's not the way I would do it now.
When you look at fast forwarding to the present day, when you look at modern progressive or left groups such as Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and like where do they get their funding from to, in Antifa's case, basically just riot in Portland every night, organize on such a mass scale, and of course they get their glowing mainstream media coverage despite what they do. There's got to be a level of either funding protection for them to just do that constantly with hardly any consequences. And despite all the, especially Antifa supporters who are arrested, there just seems to be more foot soldiers that come out.
Yes, and that's exactly the point. You hit the nail on the head. And in fact, this was the subject of the book that I wrote with David Horowitz. If you don't mind a little shameless promotion.
Yeah, that's perfect. Put it up right on the screen there.
The Shadow Party by David Horowitz and Richard Poe. And it's subheaded, How George Soros, Hillary Clinton, and 60s radicals seized control of the Democratic Party. And this book is still selling very well to this day. And the reason is because it's not a time-sensitive book. It's really a historical book. It goes all the way back in time to the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and shows how this apparatus was set up, this apparatus of color revolution, how it was set up in the United States. And at the core of these operations, what you were just talking about, how do we get so-called street radicals who are supposedly rebels against the system? Why are they being supported by the mass media and the government? And now we're after the election, we're going into an even more surreal phase where pro-Trump protesters are dangerous terrorists and insurrectionists, but these Antifa people are somehow the voice of the masses and whatever, and they're condoned and they're sponsored, and major corporations praise them and give money to them. Well, David and I discussed how this works. It's an old, well, you could think of it as an old communist tactic. Let's call it that. It was a communist tactic, but there's another story of what is communism and who really invented it. Maybe we can't get into that now. But yes, it was a communist tactic. Lenin spoke of it. It was called pressure from above and below. And what this means is you infiltrate a government, a target government, to a sufficient extent that you've pretty much you have control. And so you have politicians. Basically, what you do is you get revolutionaries in the street. That's the pressure from below, going around, raising hell, burning, looting, terrorizing everybody, getting everyone scared. And then you get politicians, that's the pressure from above, saying, oh my goodness gracious, the people are angry. The people,
Like
the
Maxine
people,
Waters and AOC and the squad.
exactly. And the people want to defund the police, and the people want this, and the people want that, and all the things that the people supposedly want. All you have to do is go to the United Nations website and look at all their programs, and that's what they want. It's all there: climate change, depopulation, you name it. Somehow, the people, these crowds of mysteriously funded and organized people, they all want all of the agendas that you see set forth on. Go to any website of any UN sponsored NGO, including
Agenda 21.
exactly. And you can go to George Soros's Open Society Institute, which used to have official consultative status with the UN. I think they don't now for some odd reason. But a lot of these groups have what they call consultative status. That's a whole other story. But basically, these NGOs, although they call them non-governmental organizations, they are actually governmental organizations. They're state actors. They're essentially licensed, financially supported, and run by the governments. And the reason they're run, the actual purpose of these organizations, as described in our book, The Shadow Party, is to create the illusion of grassroots support for all these stupid, crazy ideas that the government or certain bad actors in the government are bringing down from above. So you have the pressure from above, the government, then you have the pressure from below, the protesters, and it all comes together like the two jaws of a shark. And we get crushed in between. And so what happens when these operations are unfolding is that we, the people, ordinary people, we're watching TV or we're going on Twitter and we're saying, who are these people? Why are there people marching in the street wanting to defund the police? What are they, crazy? Who would want to do that? And we don't see any of our people protesting, because if our people protest, they're gonna get arrested and
labeled far right extremists or
exactly domestic terrorists is the new thing. And so this is a psychological operation, and it's called a color revolution. This is an integral part of this thing called color revolution, and it's a way of changing governments and changing policies in so-called democracies, but going outside of the democratic process. You simply have corrupt politicians who've been paid off or who've been blackmailed, sexually blackmailed in many cases. You mentioned Epstein. He's one very important player, or he was, assuming he's actually dead.
I think to bring up a current example, what's happening to Matt Gaetz at the moment, where he's being accused of a very pro-Trump congressman being accused of all sorts of, when they use the term sex trafficking, but of girls who are 17, there's no smoking gun to say that he's done all these things, but there's all these, they claim they have all the financial records, and that a lot of people suspect that is some sort of stitch up on him to smear, get rid of him.
Yeah, I would definitely, I don't know the details on that, but I would definitely presume innocence until guilt is proved. That this is our Anglo-Saxon tradition. And I think we should stick with it. But the fact is, many people are innocent and many people are guilty of all kinds of indiscretions and even crimes. And some of the worst criminals are allowed to go scot-free, and some minor offenders are hit very hard. So there's not, it's not black or white, especially when you get into these kinds of very personal allegations, people who have old girlfriends and former wives out there. Once you have state level national security operatives going out there interviewing everybody's exes, God help us all. I mean, seriously.
Some of that stuff is happening in Australia at the moment, with historical allegations being brought up to smear senior politicians. I won't get into that with you, but my local audience will know what I'm talking about. And going back to, as you talked about, this above and below, and this is why you can get a situation where a politician such as Joe Biden, who's been in national politics for 48 years, can run for president on a platform, I'm going to change everything, cede to all of you protesters' demands, and we're finally going to be a unified utopian nation.
Yes, and what happens when you're in the grip of this pressure from above and below, when you're stuck in the middle, is despair. What you feel is despair and apathy. It's very cleverly designed by behavioral psychologists. It's scientifically designed to create an effect of total despair, where you feel everyone's against me. I have common sense. I know it's a stupid idea to defund the police, but look, the government is against me. The people are against me. Everyone's rioting in the streets. I must be all alone. I must be the only person.
Add in the corporations, and we were talking about the cancel culture that happened to you back in 2004. Twitter wasn't even around then. It's so easy. If you just speak some common sense, you can be targeted, lose your job, have the mob can target you online, and even in real life as well.
Yes, it's a great power, but the important thing to understand is it's government power. These fake protesters in the streets would not exist without state actors. They might be contractors, they may be quote unquote private contractors who are contracted by the state. In some cases, they might be direct involvement by government agencies going on, but it's the government itself. It's the government itself. And this is what David and I were talking about in the Shadow Party. And what we showed is that this has been going on. This has been building up and developing since at least the 1930s in our country. And we showed this tremendous apparatus. It's an ideological apparatus, and it's an institutional apparatus that has been created in our country. And we showed how certain people, especially George Soros, had come to be in charge of it at that time, or at least in a very prominent position in the organization. But the thing is, there's a whole nother level to this, which is the direct government involvement. So I think it's important and it's great to ask the question that you're asking, to say, well, who are these globalists that we see staring out at us from the TV? George Soros, Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, people like this. There used to be David Rockefeller, the late David Rockefeller, always used to be trotted out as one of them. And it's almost as if these people are selected from central casting. They're just lone people, as if they're characters from a James Bond movie. Dr. No,
yes.
Exactly. They seem to have no real connection with anybody else. But the real story is these are state actors. They are state actors. Bill Gates, perfect example. you asked, how does a guy like this get power? Well, for so many years, we've been told, well, Bill Gates was this really smart, nerdy guy. In college, he started, writing software, and he was very inventive and creative. And all of a sudden, he's the richest man in the world and the most powerful software company in the world. And because he has so much money, he's gotten interested in population control because he wants to do something good for the world. And gee, we have too many people in the world, so we have to get rid of them. We have to get the population below 1 billion people. And this all supposedly came out of the head of some college kid who was supposedly nobody special, just good at computers, and he somehow created this gigantic
He's not
corporation.
involved in Microsoft anymore. He is basically full time at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and well, for the past year and a bit now, has been the go-to person about what's needed to end the pandemic, and even early on used the phrase, what is that? The final solution to the pandemic is the vaccines. He actually said that to Stephen Colbert once, and he says, what is that? The end of the pandemic will be 2022, and then there's the footage from him years back talking about a possible coronavirus pandemic. I'm not saying anything about any of those things. That's just what he said.
Yes, and that's absolutely right. And the thing about Bill Gates is we only recently learned that his father was a very prominent person involved with all these globalist agendas. He was on the board of Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood is one of the oldest, most powerful NGOs in the UN system. This is all the UN system we're talking about. That's what they call it. It's a system of non-governmental organizations, so-called, which are actually state actors working for the global government. Planned Parenthood has an odious history going back decades of doing forced sterilizations of native people in South America, all kinds of things like that. All of these deep state CIA types of agendas. They've been intimately involved with these things for so long. And Bill Gates Sr. was a director of that organization. So the whole myth that, bright, nerdy college kid Bill Gates somehow invented some software and then he became the great philanthropist who wants to depopulate the world. Strangely, his father somehow was deeply involved in this too. And I think this is what really lies behind these kind of these front people, as I was describing, people like Soros and Gates and Klaus Schwab. I think if we look into these people more deeply, what we're going to find is they were selected, yes, partly because they had certain talents and certain ability to get in front of a camera and communicate a certain type of persona. But they were also selected, I think, because of their family connections, because they came from families that were deeply connected with this globalist agenda going back for many generations. And this is why I think it's important now. It's a decision that I've made where I'm currently writing a history of globalism. I feel it's important. There's a lot of good people writing about the latest news and what's happening, and that's really vital. But we're reaching this point where people need a little more depth. They need to understand, how did we get here? How did we get in such a bizarre situation? How did we get to a situation where there is such corruption at the top, and where there just doesn't seem to be anybody who's on the side of the people? And I believe the answer is that the system we're grappling with right now, even though it uses a lot of shiny new words like Great Reset and Agenda 21.
Build Back Better is
Build back better. They always have new words that they present us with, but the agenda itself is very old. It's the agenda of a small group of people, in most cases, if not all cases, I think, people who come from very deep, highly valued bloodlines, people who have what we might call aristocratic roots or some other valued bloodline for some reason. Families that have been in these positions for centuries and maybe more than just centuries. And I can't speak with any authority about Mr. Soros or Gates or Schwab, what their ultimate family history is, but I'm guessing, just from what I've seen with so many others, I'm guessing that their families are much more special than we think they are. Bill Gates, college student who just invented Microsoft. Klaus Schwab, I think he was an engineering professor, smart guy. I'm sure he was great at engineering, but how come he's practically running the world all of a sudden?
How about the up and coming globalist entrepreneurs, you could describe it, such as Mark Zuckerberg? I mean, his sort of story to just being in college, creating this social network. It's similar to Gates and Microsoft and Elon Musk. He polarizes a lot of people. He's this eccentric businessman with these electric vehicles that he wants to go to Mars. Some people absolutely love him. Others find how he wants to invest in transhumanism abhorrent. I'd be keen to get your perspective on those two up and comers. And there's a few others who would be around as well.
Well, all I can say is I don't have anything specific to say about them other than they just, certainly, especially with Zuckerberg, he definitely seems to fit the mold that I'm talking about. Again, a story of a college student who just invented something. There's a lot of articles showing pretty convincingly that Facebook began as a military intelligence project, a DARPA project. I think it was called LifeLog. And somehow it ended up in the hands of this guy Zuckerberg. I think all of these people, especially the high-tech businesses, but not only them, the fact is, people like me, and I was really a true believer. I was a libertarian. I believed in the free market. I was never quite what you'd call a market fundamentalist, but I really did believe. I was one of those people, when communism fell, I felt we're going to have a golden age. Communism has fallen. We're going to have capitalism and free trade and free markets, and everybody will prosper and so forth. Part of me, I knew enough then to suspect that there would be bad actors who would somehow corrupt the whole process. I didn't understand how quickly or how thoroughly they would corrupt the process, especially in Russia, and especially with the help of George Soros and certain others. As I described, the privatization process, which was supposed to transfer the Soviet infrastructure, the wealth built by the Soviet Union into the hands of the people, totally hijacked by bad actors from the West, including Mr. Soros. And this is just a small part of what constantly goes on, where we really don't have a free market. Maybe it's true. Maybe this utopian idea that if people were free to buy and sell according to their own interests, somehow we would have a just society. maybe in a perfect world that would be possible, but I no longer believe it's possible in this world, because the wickedness of man is too great, and because of these old families who have been playing this game for so many centuries. Just think of the wealth that these people have. And when I say these people, I'm talking about who were the founders. Think of it. 500 years ago, Columbus sailed to America, Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa, and suddenly we had the age of exploration, and basically European white people conquered the entire world, or at least those from a small handful of countries in Europe, basically conquered the entire planet. Well, that enterprise of conquering and developing the planet was a highly organized enterprise, and it was organized in the form of joint stock companies. Every time an expedition was sent out, certainly this was the case with England and Holland. I'm not sure how the Portuguese and Spanish handled this, but let's say an expedition went out from England. I certainly know with the American colonies, each time there was a joint stock company formed, and the crown would get a certain share, and the directors, the people who owned it, were they weren't just anybody. They were important people. The people with in many cases of the nobility, sometimes people of the so-called merchant class, but very wealthy, powerful people. So these were the ground level investors. Think of it. 500 years ago, imagine if you were a ground level investor in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or some other, all the 13 colonies of the United States, or anywhere around the world. There were ground level investors. There were certain people who invested, and they have the gains they have realized from 500 years ago to this day. I have to think those gains were not lost. I'm not aware that anyone ever dissolved those corporations or took the money and gave it to some charity, or I don't know.
You mentioned John Rockefeller, who the Rockefeller family first came to prominence in the United States in the late 19th century. Their influence today is still ever present. They still have members of the family as politicians. One, Nelson Rockefeller, was vice president. They just seem to live on. The same with the Morgan family as well.
Yes, that's true. Although, again, this is my particular perspective. You may not share it, but I'm always interested and a little troubled by the fact that the figures that we're allowed to be familiar with, people like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller, we're told these are the big the richest men in the world, the men who created this modern globalist monstrosity that we're living with today. And yet when you look at their life stories, similar to Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, basically these people are nouveau riche. These are people who supposedly didn't become rich until 150 years ago. So who had all the money before then? And some of the names we're familiar with, those of us who research these kinds of things, we become familiar with certain names that always come up. Some of them are a little older than 100, maybe they're 200, 250 years ago. But, Tim, 250 years ago is nothing. It's really a very short time. And I'll tell you quite frankly, I don't believe that the richest people in the world are people who just made their money in the last couple hundred years. That makes no sense to me for the reason I said. because there's been so much investment for so long in such profitable enterprises, especially in the last 500 years, the enterprise of conquering the entire world. John D. Rockefeller was not a ground level investor in the conquest of the world. He came along after it was already conquered. I think the money is older. I think people like Morgan and Rockefeller are nouveau riche. And I'm getting more interested now in the old money. Who is the old money? How far back does it go? And how much money do they really have? And where do they keep it? You're not going to see these people on the Forbes 400 list because they have tax havens and shell corporations. They have all kinds of ways of concealing their wealth. And how much do they really have? I think that's a really important question for people to start thinking about these days, in my humble opinion.
Oh, you're certainly going to get me to start asking that question as well. Hopefully, with your upcoming book, you can provide some answers. Now, obviously, the Trump presidency was an aberration in the advancement of these globalist goals. He was not meant to be president, and for the 4 years of his presidency, the deep state, mainstream media were at him all the time. And when I say deep state, I'm not just talking about the intelligence agencies. They're also the bad actors you talked about. That's when during the Trump presidency, that's when the Antifa riots began, and they eventually got him in the 2020 election. And obviously, the way that I described January 6th, it was just a bizarre unfolding of events. The fact that the US Capitol, supposedly one of the most secure buildings in the world, could be breached with weird QAnon people able to go into the chamber, and Biden claims that's it's the one of the worst events in democracy. What is it? Chuck Schumer compared it to Pearl Harbor and 9/11. You obviously would have observed the Trump presidency and its end. Just how much did that disrupt things as they were meant to be?
Well, as far as the election itself, of course, that's being litigated right now, and so I'm not going to speak to that too much, except that it's
you can't on YouTube.
Yes, exactly. But it's being litigated, and I'm quite sure we're going to get some answers about that. But it kind of goes back to this issue of pressure from above and below, because here was an instance where a president was trying to do the same thing that the usual color revolution crowd does. This cluster of NGOs that Soros and people like that work with, they were doing the same thing. They were saying, oh, there's been a stolen election, so let's take to the streets and let's make ourselves heard. In Yugoslavia, in 2000, a color revolution that was partly funded by George Soros and others, they marched on the Parliament building and set fire to it. And they had heavy military equipment. They had automatic weapons. They had artillery at checkpoints around the city of Belgrade, and they literally set fire to the Parliament building, and a few people were killed. And this was praised as a wonderful thing. And so this strangely over-the-top reaction to the January 6th protests is part of this psychological operation that I was describing, where what they're doing is they're using behavioral psychology on us to say, look, they're putting it right in our face. They're saying, if protesters approved by us do something, it's okay. If your protesters do something, you will be treated as domestic terrorists, and you will be treated very harshly. And this just feeds into the despair. The whole point is despair. Remember, the pressure from above is the government. The pressure from below are the protesters. And we in the middle are made to feel there is no hope. The government is against us. The so-called people are against us. And if our own people, our own protesters try to do anything, they will be mercilessly crushed by the state. It's all part of the same psychological operation whose purpose is to make us feel that we have no options, that the government is totally against us, the military is against us, the national security apparatus is against us, and there is no hope. How do you make an enemy surrender? You drop leaflets on them saying, you're surrounded, you have no way out, you have no hope, surrender. So that's what they're saying to us. And I can't really tell you or anyone else how we should address this, other than to say my approach has been to sit back and say, okay, I have certain skills, I have a certain track record, certain research that I've been doing for many years. Let me just focus on that and try to get this book out that will help people to understand at least something important about how this apparatus works. I don't have to solve the whole problem. I'm just one person. We can't be an army of one. We have to have faith that good will prevail. And, I don't know what you believe. I do believe in fate. I believe in destiny. I believe in God. I believe that if you act on faith, that somehow or other it will turn out for the good. Maybe it's not true, but it's what I believe, and it's what keeps me going. So each of us has our own area of competence and ability, and I feel the best thing we can do at a time like this is to focus very close. At least the best thing I can do. Focus very closely on my area of competence, the thing that I know how to do, the thing that I've been doing for many years, which is connecting dots, researching, and just trying to figure out what's going on, and just have faith that somehow that knowledge might help others to understand things and to see where we should go next in my own small way. And I think all of us have those areas of competency. You with your podcast and whatever else you're doing, I'm sure you're doing a lot. Somehow we all have to ignore the psyop. We have to ignore the pressure from above and below. This psyop that's being played on us to make us think there's no hope. Of course there's hope. And the hope comes specifically from realizing that pressure from above and below is at its base an illusion. The whole reason this type of operation is pursued is to create a great delusion in the minds of people that we're outnumbered, that there's all these nutcases out there who want to have the Great Reset and who want to be transhuman and all this kind of stuff. They're not that many. We're just being psyoped into believing there are many. We are the majority. By we, I mean sane people who are sane, people who are well-meaning, people who want what is best for ourselves, our families, and our people. We are the majority. We are the human race, and these other people are just They're evil. They're people whose hearts have been filled with wickedness. And they have nothing to offer us except death and destruction and corruption and more wickedness. And so we have to have faith in our own goodness and believe that the right and the just will prevail.
I think that's an excellent summary to end on. I wanted to finish the show with, just getting you to talk about your other life passion, which is kayaking, because obviously you can't just being fixated on the studying the globalists all the time. You've got to have an outlet, do something else to clear the mind, and you've chosen hiking, and you and your wife Marie made a short documentary, The Way of the Kayak.
Well, yeah, I started kayaking back in the 90s, and it's just I mean, part of the attraction is it's cheap. You know, that I remember once we were me and a bunch of other kayakers, we were in the Hudson River. This big huge yacht came by and making all, you know, we were all bouncing in the wake, and we all kind of looked at it, and we all looked at each other and said, I'm so glad I don't have a big, stupid, gas-guzzling yacht like that. I'm glad that I'm sitting here in this little plastic boat with a paddle. You know, so it's sort of like you make yourself feel good saying, we're out here with all these yachtsmen, but we don't have a yacht. We just have this plastic boat. But that's okay. You're out there, you know, the ocean liners and the freighters, and they're all going past, and you feel like you're part of it. You know, a very small part, but you're part. But now, the movie you're talking about, I made a short film, The Way of the Kayak. My wife produced it. She's a film producer and TV producer. And it was just, I had been kayaking many years, and I had always admired people who could roll the kayak, because that's really the whole point of a kayak. And somehow I'd never quite gotten it. And finally, in I guess it was 2013. I went up to Canada. I had a writing project. We spent several weeks up in Canada in the Admiralty Islands, part of the Thousand Islands. Beautiful, beautiful place, and great kayaking community. And some people up there. There's an outfit called Thousand Islands Kayaking. I'll give them a little plug. You know, it's just a great, great place to go. And they were so supportive. They gave me so much support, so much training. They had great equipment, and just a beautiful environment, you know, to just go out there and do whatever you want. And so they started me on the training. You know, we went over the basic rescues, started on the rolling, and then when I came back to New York, I finally I hooked up with another outfit, Manhattan Kayak, and finally I did my first roll in the Hudson River up near the Tappan Zee Bridge, and I got it on film. I was filming everything because I just thought, maybe I'll never do this again. You know, maybe I'll roll it once and I'll never be able to roll it again. I wanted to capture it. So I realized, you know, after a while, let's make this a film. And it's really just, it was when I finally was able to do that roll, you know, I don't know how to explain it, except when you're in a boat, the worst thing you can imagine is to capsize. You know, it's like if you're in a plane, what's the worst thing? Crash. In a boat, the worst thing is to capsize. The thing about a kayak is you deliberately capsize. You're hanging upside down in the water. You're stuck inside of a boat. And somehow through this magical maneuver that was invented by the Inuit people, you just take your paddle and you go like this, and boom, you're right back right side up again. Well, once I learned that, I just couldn't stop doing it. I was doing it and doing it and doing it, and it made me feel so good. It was such a wonderful feeling that I had to share it with others. I just felt I have to make a film that will at least somehow partly make other people feel this feeling, what it really feels like to, such a simple thing, capsize a boat, hang upside down in the water, and then come back up. To me, that's a big deal. Maybe not to you, maybe not to others. To me, that's like a huge thing. So I made this little film. It was in a number of film festivals, did very well. And me and Marie, we keep saying we're going to do a 30-minute version, try to get it on TV. Haven't had the time to do that yet, but we certainly have enough footage to do it. Because I took a lot of footage up in Canada and in New York. You know, I did a circumnavigation of Manhattan, which is almost 30 miles and takes 8 or 9 hours to do. And I went with my instructor, guy named Cam. He's in the film, and we just had a great time, paddling and rolling, and just being part of nature right in the middle of New York City. And it was all filmed. A lot of it's in that little 5-minute film, but it was a peak moment. I will call it a peak moment in my life, being able to roll a kayak, which again, maybe that just shows that I'm easily satisfied. You know, that's all it takes. I can roll a kayak. I feel like that's it. I've done it.
Well, it's an intriguing story, I must say, and well, a lot of people they will have gone through life not even kayaking and discovering that joy. So it's certainly an interesting story. I've thoroughly enjoyed having you as a guest on my show to, well, not just talk about these globalists, but what is motivating their whole operation and how much far back in history it goes. It's been a very enlightening episode. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you.
And I can't wait for your book, your globalism history book.
Working on it.
Take care, Richard, and enjoy the rest of your day. It's daybreak over there now. So,
you too, Tim. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. And that's the show for this week. Now, before I finish the show for tonight, I wanting to pre-announce that obviously this the WilmsFront format, the weekly edition, has been featured interview, but I also like bringing you the news and putting it in an overall perspective picture for you. Now it's very hard to do that in a single show which has a guest and go through the news as well. So starting on Monday, May the 10th, I'm going to be doing a new weekly news show. You could call it a spin-off WilmsFront. That's going to go for half an hour, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time on the WilmsFront YouTube and D Live. So there's going to be a separate news summary picture show on the Monday, and then going to keep the Thursday for extended feature interviews. And of course, the other change is coming tomorrow night with Trad Tasman Talk. Its new fortnightly time of 6 p.m. Melbourne time, back on the Unshackled's YouTube channel and also on the Trad Tasman Talk Odyssey channel. As the Trad Tasman Talk on Odyssey, I've begun to upload a lot of episodes of various Unshackled productions to Odyssey afterwards. Now it's got live streaming for at least Trad Tasman Talk. Hopefully the other shows we can start rolling it out as well as Odyssey grows. The Unshackled main channel is back since, as I said, we're going to be streaming Trad Tasman Talk to it. So new reports from Tiger Mountain are back being uploaded to the Unshackled main channel. And of course, keep checking the unshackled.net for the Unshackled Productions archive and also Unshackled articles and commentary. I'll see you tomorrow night for Trad Tasman Talk. And I, of course, will see you next week for the final, or when I say final, weekly edition of WilmsFront, because there's going to be two separate WilmsFront. The news summary, 30 minutes on Mondays, 8:30, and then the Thursday extended interview featuring a featured guest. So hopefully that's those two separate formats. I will certainly enjoy having a separate news show and separate featured interview show. So I hope that you enjoy the new formats as well when it premieres. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV to view the archive of episodes. And keep visiting the unshackled.net to view all our shows and to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.